when we say that you're putting me in a box, or I'm constricted in playing this part, or we think of, if there's a particular role to play, that means it's a stereotype, and stereotypes are bad because it doesn't honor our individuality. Then we're not seeing the potential upside of having these roles, of having a boundary within to express ourselves.
Yeah, and I would to add to that, I agree that people kind of think of me as this person that's like all big on like structure and roles, and everyone needs to just like be these robots that do this. Like, no. There is absolutely room for our own individual expression, but the problem is that we need to have the structure itself, because if it's totally unbounded, like you're saying, I love that. That's a great analogy. The riverbed and the flowing water. Like, if you just have water, it's shapeless, formless, and it loses any meaning. So anyway, let's just start real quick with just kind of a brief introduction. We've interacted a little bit online. I've seen kind of what you're involved in, but tell me a little bit about you.
Sure. Yeah. So, I first came across your stuff just a month or so ago when somebody posted one of your videos on the Latter-day Saint subreddit. And I think that was maybe something that was a bit of a lightning rod and got a lot of engagement for you.
Was that the Julie Hanks video?
Yeah, I think it was.
I that one got a little bit of attention.
Yeah. So I think I was one of those pairs of eyeballs that started looking into your stuff. But so as far as a background for a bit about me, I grew up in the church. My mom was a convert, and so it was great getting to have a bit of an experience, just having a bit of pioneer heritage, but also wild olive branch, as it were. Nice. Experience. Grew up in Northern Virginia, outside of DC, and started a mission in Idaho. So I got cool. Plunged right into
was it Boise?
Culture. I got called to Boise.
Nice.
I never served in Boise. So
I see. I think I have a relative who served in Boise. I wonder if you guys might have known each other, because you guys are probably close to the same age. So anyway, that's side note.
Yeah, I mean, about a year in, it split into 3 missions for us. So,
okay.
Yeah, I got reassigned to Nampa, the big metropolis of Nampa. But so after that, I finished up my bachelor's and then also got a master's at Utah State. There, started dating my now wife. She was actually living down near Provo at the time, so we would either meet up in Salt Lake area, or I would make the 2-hour drive to get a date. So that was the time of my life.
Nice.
But yeah, at this point, I've just been exploring a lot of what it means to be a member of the church right now, and just really engaged in this cultural conversations that's been going on.
Yeah, and the cultural conversation certainly is a little wild. So just real quick, what is your take on, to kind of sum things up, what do you feel like are the, what does it mean to be a Latter-day Saint in today's day and age?
Yeah, I think what that means is there's going to be a lot of people inside and outside of the church that are disappointed for different reasons, because the church, as led by Jesus Christ through his anointed, his apostles and prophets, they're always going to find a third way where they don't fall necessarily easily on one side or the other, except on, I guess, really core doctrines and things, and we can get into that. But as far as that, I think it really, we're seeing the political become more important than faith.
Yeah, I would agree. Now, when you say the third way, so one of the things that I get a little bit frustrated with is sort of the way, and I think President Nelson's labels, just that talk on labels was just so good. And it was so exactly what we needed, because I think it is wrong that we end up dividing the world into this sort of left and right. We begin to organize and orient ourselves around tribes rather than around, is it true? Is it false? I always say, I don't really care if it's left, right, center, up, down, sideways, Chinese. I don't care. I want to know, is it true or is it false? And I also don't make the silly assumption that, well, there's equal truth on the left and equal truth on the right, or however people want to parse that out. Like, no, there is truth and there is falsehood. And I don't care. I take it issue by issue, and I look at it through that lens. And I think that some people think, well, there's left, which gets, you don't want to be too far on the left. You don't want to be too far on the right. The best is the middle road. And sort of that sort of a mentality that being moderate, the church is kind of in the middle, right? Because you said the third way. You didn't say the middle way. So what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I think I went through my phase of referring to myself as a centrist, but I think the more people sort of criticize that idea, the more I came to I think a deeper understanding of what that means to choose a third way on a political issue or anything else. I'm reminded of I think it's in the book of Revelation where John is talking about, I'd rather you not be lukewarm, rather be hot or cold.
Yeah.
And I think it comes down to, it's not about a wishy-washiness or a veneer of understanding on a particular issue. It's being able to take the nugget of truth from either argument and purge away all of the rhetoric and the sophistry around each one, then find a way to unify it. I think to me, it's a lot about the parsing out and unification of truth, which
and that's that. So if I'm hearing you correctly, you're saying that this third way is to essentially, it sounds similar to kind of what I was saying as far as like, find the truth. The truth is what matters. But unfortunately, in our society, truth and falsehood are usually pretty well tangled up together. And I say there's a lot of, I use the analogy that there's a lot of beautiful cakes out there with shards of glass in them. And what you're saying is kind of get rid of the glass and try and keep the stuff that's good from it and use that as some sort of a unifying thing to bring people together. Because if I'm talking to you and we disagree, but I know that there's some truth in there that's inspiring you to be committed to this, whether it's maybe you're like care for those who are oppressed, like that's a good thing, or for people that face bullying or other things, like those are good things. We all agree there, right? And so what you're saying is that this third way is to sort of, if I'm understanding right, is to kind of keep the good that's in there and work from that basis instead of just constantly harping on the bad. Is that kind of the way that you look at it?
Yeah. And I'd expand in saying that, going back to the hot and cold analogy, it's when I think about defining and dissecting what is true about a particular issue or an argument for or against an issue, once I get to the bottom of it, or I feel like I've identified what's true about this, what's right, then I will boldly defend it or boldly declare it. Like there's a heat, there's a confidence and a boldness behind this process, which is, I think, contrasted to what we typically hear criticized about the centrism perspective, where it's just like everything's got a little bit of good in it, and so there's just like let's let everyone be. I think the issue here in a lot of ways is that only so many people are going to think deeply through these issues or whatever it is. They have a certain amount of buy-in. They have a certain amount of time and resources to actually put towards work out what's the logical conclusion of enacting this policy or repealing this policy, or whatever it might be. repealing a doctrine or affirming a doctrine again. So yeah, I think the issue is that there are a lot of, to maybe torture your metaphor, as far as like cakes, there are a lot of cakes for sale. There are a lot of made and ready ideologies or perspectives on certain things that it's really digestible. You can just adopt it and say, okay, well, that's pretty much everything I believe, so I don't have to think anymore about it.
And you put that label on you.
And I think it takes, yeah. And I mean, it's easy. And I think to a certain extent, we all do that. It just depends on which thing matters most to you, that you probably spend the most time thinking about.
Definitely. So what's an example that you might use of, not to get into the weeds, but that's kind of like, there's a lot of general principles, and I find this, Jordan Peterson, everyone knows I'm a huge fan, so I always talk about him, but he recently gave a talk in Utah that I actually went and saw. I was there, and it was about not hiding things in the fog. And the whole idea was really this sort of principle of specificity, that when we just talk in generalities, which we do a lot of in the church, because we tend to talk about general principles, which is good. And I think that at the general level of the church, we should expect that. But we're in the individual level of the church. We're where the rubber meets the road. We're dealing with the specific situations where we need to apply the general principles to a particular situation. And so, like you're saying, to kind of bring this into a more detailed level, what's an example of something that maybe is a contentious issue where there's elements of truth in it? Do you have any examples like that maybe come to mind?
Yeah. How about let's take the issue of personal authority versus priesthood authority.
Yeah. So just so anyone who's knowing, obviously this is kind of a reference to something that Julie Hanks talks about a lot, is this notion of personal authority. And I recently made a video critiquing that. So yeah, let's go into that. I'm very interested in your perspective.
Yeah. So here's the thing. So I'll start by saying, I think both are right and both can be honored at the same time. And in constraining your acceptable proceedings from that, we get to that straight and narrow path towards Christ, I believe. So I think the good in honoring one's personal authority has a lot to do. I mean, I think one of the reasons why it's such a talked about issue these days, especially among women, is because there seems to be so much about, in these, I would say in the developmental years of being a teenager and into early adulthood, there is so little to help somebody come into their own and to develop their self-identity, that the easier thing to do, which in and of itself is not bad, I don't think, is to adopt the identity of those around you, or in reaction to those around you. So that, I think, is a very natural thing, especially for children or young adults to do. And when we come to this real life transition of developing our own identity, we start to question everything. And unfortunately, there's the, I think, popular way of thought where there's no end to questioning. And you try to get to the bottom of everything, and it turns out there's no bottom at which you can get to the final, like, this is the only rational, logical thing that I can base my whole identity on. It's a never-ending spiral in that way, I think. And so
just I just want to kind of see what you're saying. So you're saying that as people begin to grow up, teenage years, developmental years, as you're developing your sense of self, your own sense of identity, that are you saying that within the church there is not a good, let's say, culture or something like that to help you develop a healthy sense of self-identity? Is that sort of the thing that you're saying there? Or what is it when you kind of say that people, that there aren't, I guess you said something like tools or something like that to help people develop this sense of self and to establish their identity. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I would say that I think the church does a lot to help foster that, and especially help foster it in a way that's developmentally appropriate by age. I mean, we have, well, I guess things have sort of been changing with the new youth program and all that, but I think by and large, yeah, I would say, let's just say Western society, or even just America. There are times in life where there's a big transition. I think the one we're talking about now is just from being a child to being an adult. That's a big transition.
Yeah.
I would say from not being a parent to being a parent, big transition.
Yeah.
And these things can often be very taxing psychologically. They can be the cause of a ton of stress and a disintegration of a feeling of health. And one of the more effective ways that we can deal with this is through strong structures and, dare I say, even rituals. Like, there are certain things that we do to honor these transitions and to help make it a healthy thing rather than a thing that makes us crumble apart and not be put together again.
Got it.
So, yeah.
And so what's going wrong? I mean, at the end of the day, it seems like, from my perspective, civilizationally, as a Western society, we're facing what amounts, in my mind, to an identity crisis. We seem to have no sense of who we are, what we're supposed to be. And we live in this world of expressive individualism where people just, the highest good is to just be whatever you want to be. And the problem is if you can be whatever you want to be, well, then what should you be? And is anything that you are better than anything else? And what is the highest good? And there's just this, you end up in this, in my mind, a sea of chaos where you don't have, at least as a culture and as a people, we've lost touch with kind of the notion of ideals themselves, to where we used to sort of have within our society in the West sort of a, this is what a man is. This is what a woman is. This is how we're all, this is the game we're playing. And here's the role we all have in the game. And this is what we're all trying to accomplish. And I feel like that has just, as a general broad society, that has happened. And I see it happening to some extent within the church, where people feel less certain about, what we're all supposed to be doing and where everyone fits in the picture. So do you think that is, how do we, first of all, is that the problem? Or do you see that same kind of thing happening? And is there some sort of a solution to it? Like, how do we start to fix this?
Yeah, I think I have a lot of thoughts about this, but let's just start with, I was talking to my wife, Miranda, about this as I was preparing for our conversation and just thinking through some questions. And I like your analogy about, like, we're all going to play a game, and here are the roles that we play, and let's all do it, play the best game that we can. I came up with a similar analogy of what I think we're seeing today is, I think a growing and even dominant attitude now culturally is, were you to show up to, like, a play rehearsal and you told the director, actually, the role that I'm in, I'm just gonna, like, improv everything, like, toss out the script, that's not me, I think I can do better than that, or, like, this is too hard, so I'm going to just make it my own. That, I think, it's so then the play just turns into an improv show. It stops being what it was originally. And I think the answer to that, just to extend the analogy, the metaphor, is the way you honor your own individuality, your own uniqueness. Because my my uniqueness is typically what people like talk about when they are talking about rejecting ideals.
Yeah.
That I am the ideal. And
Yeah,
so
you set what there's no external ideal to
yeah.
you. It is this is my truth. This is what I want, which by the way is a garbage. Anyway, I just like gag every time I hear the word my
Yeah.
truth. But anyway, the idea is that there isn't this external thing that is the good that I need to conform to. The highest good is my own liberty to express whatever it is that I want.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I think just to go back to this metaphor about a play, the way we honor both of those things is we keep the roles. Everyone has their role and their part. But if you have ever gone to a certain play or you love a certain musical or something, typically you'll have a favorite actor or actress depending on the cast. If it's really successful, there will be different casts all around the world and across time. And you'll find that you like a particular person's performance of that part more than any other.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's the individuality is expressed in adopting that role.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and in the way, so you're saying kind of in the way that you play the role, right? Because
right.
I mean, we all might be playing baseball, but we all know that me playing baseball and pitching and Nolan Ryan pitching, there's a whole different individuality here that says that I'm not Nolan Ryan or LeBron James in basketball or whatever. And not only that, playing the game, you can play it with a certain style, right? And I even think about when, like, another analogy that I like to use is the idea of an orchestra. We all have a different instrument, but not everyone plays instruments the same. And not everyone's the same instrument. And like I said, we're all playing the same song, but you can play different instruments. You can play the same song on it, and you can even create different renditions of it according to it. But there still are parameters within that you still like. Individuality exists, but within a framework. It doesn't exist totally unbounded. And if it does, it, in my mind, and you have obviously much more training in this, but psychologically, spiritually, whatever, it is incredibly disorienting when you don't have a framework to fit into.
Yeah. And so I'd say that the way I think about these things is in terms of masculinity and femininity. And these are very sticky words to use. So maybe I'll just try to stay away from that for now. And
not to me. I love those words.
Yeah.
They're just the reality of human nature.
Yeah. And I think, I'll probably be spending the rest of my life trying to figure out how to communicate these ideas to people who don't like those words. But the idea here is there's yet another metaphor that I've heard where if you would equate femininity to flowing water, masculinity, when it's healthy, would be the riverbed. That it is the structure and the framework that allows the feminine creativity, the potentiality to flow. And so these things work together. When we say that you're putting me in a box, or I'm constricted in playing this part, or we think of if there's a particular role to play, that means it's a stereotype, and stereotypes are bad because it doesn't honor our individuality, then we're not seeing the potential upside of having these roles, of having a boundary within to express ourselves.
Yeah, and I would to add to that, I agree that people kind of think of me as this person that's like all big on like structure and roles, and everyone needs to just like be these robots that do this. Like, no. There is absolutely room for our own individual expression, but the problem is that we need to have the structure itself, because if it's totally unbounded, like you're saying, I love that. That's a great analogy. The riverbed and the flowing water. Like if you just have water, it's shapeless, formless, and it loses any meaning. But if it has a structure to it, then it can be channeled into purposes and causes and actually have form. So I like that analogy a lot. So you're saying that the masculine sort of energy or ethos of sort of structure and order, to kind of play on maybe that sort of psychological outlook, is associated more with masculine energy, whereas the more free and expressive side of it, creative energy, tends to, at least sort of mythologically and culturally, has usually tended to be more associated with the feminine. Is that kind of your take on that?
Yeah, I would say that basically, and we'll see what other people think about that. But yeah, as far as thinking of an example of a real life situation where that plays out, I can think I know vanishingly few guys who do arts and crafts as adults for fun, not as an infantilizing thing. Like, that's a hobby, like particular hobbies that we gravitate towards. I mostly see women in my life do watercolors, painting, just for fun. And the idea of expression for the sake of expression is something that I would say is more feminine than masculine, because from my perspective, and maybe from a lot of other people, I think one of the reasons why, say, modern art, the abstract kind of stuff, sort of falls on deaf ears, so to speak, is because we don't see the purpose. We don't see the story, the structure of it. We don't see the point. And I think for a lot of people, there's just this underlying axiomatic assumption that anything that exists has to justify its own existence. Otherwise, it shouldn't exist. It should make way for things that can justify its own existence.
Yeah.
But I think the more feminine way of seeing that is that things just are. I just am. And that's, I mean, I think there are plenty of people who get that from like the more Eastern philosophy kind of stuff, and that's a very rewarding perspective to explore.
And I think, and again, to go to your thing, there's truth in that 100%. Like, and that's where I think, sort of to tie it into the sort of third way, another way of thinking of this is that these things need to be integrated into something. It is not that we tend to, I guess I would say it this way. If you only have that creative aspect without any purpose to it, there's no meaning. Okay. Things become meaningful when they fall into some sort of a structure, some sort of a purpose, some sort of an end goal, right? And so it is this integration of the masculine and feminine. And I don't say that like you're a man, therefore 100% masculine. Right. I think that's another thing that's wrongly understood, is that using the terms masculinity and femininity may cause people to think that it's sort of a man is 100% masculine and a woman is 100% feminine. And that's not true. I would tend to think that they tend to lean more that way with their, let's say, their energy, their spirit, but they're not that way 100%, and they shouldn't be, right? We need to find a way to integrate these two sort of forces, psychologically or even biologically, to create something that's greater than the sum of its parts, right? I kind of that's just kind of my way of framing the masculine and feminine. They exist within every person, and there's a need for integration of them, both on the level of the individual, on the relationship level between males and females, and on the social level between all of society itself.
Yes. So I do absolutely agree that there's different levels of analysis that we can take this. And for me, like, as much as I do enjoy thinking about this on the cultural level, I think what's most impactful is thinking about it on the individual and couples level. I think, I mean, there's a reason why the yin yang symbol has been such an enduring symbol from Taoism, because when we think of that white paisley, which represents the masculine power, the masculine principle, let's say, there's that black dot in it. And on the other side of things, the feminine, the black paisley, has the white dot in it. Now, we get into trouble, I would say, thinking about this psychologically, spiritually, when we try to fill in the dot, when we try to say we're all just one thing.
Yeah.
Now, I think in a lot of ways, especially between couples, that they tend to balance each other out, that there's a polarity that can come between two people. I personally, for a lot of my life, actually prided myself on my ability to empathize and relate with people. And so I saw myself as more of a feminine guy. Mm-hmm. Now, when I married my wife, first couple years, it was sort of crazy, because for as empathetic and insightful as I saw myself as being, she was way more considerate and in tune with other people's needs. And so that sort of actually pushed me towards the other side. And I started to fill out where I was meant to be within that relationship. And so that's what I mean when I say polarity, is that we help bring out opposite but complementary virtues of communication or behavior.
So how does this, do you think that this has something to do, this understanding of sort of masculine and feminine energies on sort of a psychological / spiritual level, that has something to do theologically, or I guess, what do you think the theological implications are of that within our own faith tradition? Because we have more than any other Christian religion, an emphasis on the unity of the masculine and the feminine in order to achieve the highest potential that we have. Do you think that that has to do with what we're talking about?
Yeah, I think it absolutely does. I mean, not just our emphasis on eternal marriage, but I would say on the nature of God, that we know that God is perfectly just and perfectly merciful. And we have a lot of scriptures that beautifully expand on that. And I think I'm forgetting the verse, but it even genders justice as masculine and mercy as feminine. There are plenty of Instagram accounts out there right now that are idealizing homestead life and just getting back to this pastoral utopia, because there's low infrastructure, is basically what it is that you eat what you kill or what you harvest, and there's a much stronger connection between the things that keep your family healthy and the work that you've done to do that. And so I think in that way, there's a lot of, I think that's wrapped up in a man's need for purpose. And that being connected to the work he's done and the results of it, it's harder to do. It's not impossible, but it becomes harder the more men from before, or people from before, have put in the work, built the buildings, built the roads, and are running everything, keeping the water on. Like, all of this stuff is done for you.
There is
you just
something,
pay the bills.
There is something definitely in every man's heart that desires to go and like build a building, a cabin for his family, and kill a deer and bring it home. And and regardless of like, and I say that on kind of a general level, that within the masculine energy in most men, there's sort of this desire to want to provide. And when you provide in a more direct manner, it's immensely meaningful and satisfying, because it connects right down to the very deepest core of who you are and where you fit in this picture of, I am a man and this is what a man does. And I think as we lose these definitions of men and women, and we homogenize them, that again, there's a kernel of truth in it that says, women should be allowed to vote. You know what I mean? But then there's another side of it where we go so far as to say, well, there is no difference between men and women, And so it is, what is true and what's false here is what we need to parse out, and what is arbitrary and what is not arbitrary and based on the actual natures that men and women have between them, and figuring out how to integrate those. And that's a very challenging thing. Now I have another topic I wanted to go into, but do you have anything else you wanted to hit on with relation to the relationship between the masculine and the feminine?
To wrap that up, I think I've seen a lot of people, make that argument of, well, there's masculinity, femininity, that's just sexist stereotypes. Let's just do away with that. Just be a good person. And I was talking to, again, my wife last night about how if you go broad enough, if you go too broad, things start to lose their transformative power. They lose the ability to affect change within a person or even within a society. So when you go so broad as to say, just be a good person, that ignores the individuality and patterns within certain groups of how they approach that, the honoring of opposite but complementary virtues. So when we talk about being just and merciful, which God is, I think a lot of guys will start out being just. They will start out wanting to enforce borders and laws related to that, whereas the other side is to be merciful. Now, this in excess turns into permissiveness and eventually abuse. Either side turns to abuse, but either side an extreme. But when we look at these things, the opposite of integration is this amorphous androgyny. Now, it's in the path of this third way of trying to take what you have, honor what you do have, and then build upon it, rather than get rid of the cultural support of those things, and then just say, just be a good person.
There is within this integration, and this idea is also sort of what we in the church talk about, is sort of this idea of bridling your passions, right? We don't crush our passions. Your passions actually have a place, but the idea is that they need to be channeled and put into proper use and fully expressed there, right? There's this, I think it was G.K. Chesterton who said, we think that the lion and the lamb lie down together because the lion lost his ferocity and he's no longer a lion, right? But the idea here between the lion and the lamb laying down together, and this is not his quote, I'm using kind of a paraphrase of what he was getting at, was this idea that the lion is still just as ferocious of a lion as he ever was. And the lamb and him lie down together because they're properly integrated together. And so it's this idea of not to quash the nature that's within you. Like, don't crush your soul and your spirit into something that doesn't have the feelings and the passions that you have, but rather to recognize that these have a place and they have not a place. And a good one to use is your sexuality and your own erotic, desires that people have. It is sort of like those sorts of things. I use the analogy when I've taught the young men about it. It's like, it's fire. Okay. Fire is an incredibly useful tool. It can keep you alive. It can keep you warm. It can cut through metal, but it also can burn down the house and kill everyone in the most horrible manner you can ever imagine. So be careful with the fire. Use it. Don't put it out. Don't think that you're not supposed to have it because you can't put it out. Find the proper uses for it. And that goes for, I think, not just our sexuality, but I think a bunch of different aspects of our nature where things are destructive, not because they in and of themselves are bad, but rather because they are not properly integrated into the way of being that our Heavenly Father wants us to be, in accordance with, what I'll call sort of the celestial order of being.
Yeah. And I think to maybe circle back on this, the conflict at times between personal and general authority is there is power in personal authority. Like there is a reason to nurture that and grow it and honor it. What is the issue is when we misuse it, when we use it in inappropriate ways. And so the thing I've seen, and because I've seen it in my own life, I was telling you about how I went from thinking I was like such an empathetic guy to, oh, my life is like even more this way. I have to balance this out somehow. I have to be more bold. I have to be more confident, more directive at times. There has to be a clear forward direction in how we're steering this relationship or making decisions, whatever. That this balance of expression and boundaries to limit it, that I think a lot of women today are struggling with is, how do I, because they're starting from the perspective, I think, in a lot of ways, just judging on what I've seen them saying, is that they think that the box is meant to crush them. It's meant to crush their individuality. But what would solve that issue is actually to self-advocate, which we're seeing Julie Hanks and others do, is like becoming a proponent of self-advocacy. But don't burn the house down in the process. So there is this back and forth that we have to do, where there's that, again, the boundary, and within it you can self-express, but sometimes people need a push and then a bit of coaching, like a little bit of just directions given on how to express that and keep it healthy.
And I think the devil comes down in the details in those things, because so I don't like to use the word personal authority. I think that is it's just not a gospel thing from what I can tell in any way. It is not like I want to ask, if I were to have Julie Hanks on the podcast, first thing I'd ask her, well, how do you distinguish between personal agency and personal authority? Because authority, like, we all know we have personal agency, and we all know that we can choose to disobey and, not do what we're told. Now, the thing is that, and I do know that general counsel can be given, and we do need to apply that to our individual circumstances. I get that. That is not a thing that's there. But to label that as a personal authority, and that authority trumps the authority of the brethren, to a degree, I understand that, in the sense that, yes, you have personal agency and you can use that to reject the words of the brethren. We know. But to claim that, therefore, there is an aura of approbation, or that it is acceptable to say, well, I have my own authority, so I'm just going to reject what they say, and that somehow is justified on the grounds of personal authority, is, I think, dangerous. Now, with that said, I also do believe that, yes, I think that when general counsel is given, we need to see how to apply it to our individual circumstances. But I also don't believe that not all counsel is so general as to, where you can just say, like, if I want to, go and engage in an open marriage, and the prophets have, quote unquote, counseled against it, well, I can't claim personal authority and think that I'm justified in doing that. Like, no, like, that is not a general counsel. That's a very specific counsel that I am rejecting. So, and I also, because I'm a believer in prophetic fallibility, I will say, yeah, I may just full on be like, yeah, I think they're wrong about this, and go that way. But I don't claim that as my personal authority that somehow trumps them. I just say, I have my own agency, and I'm not just choosing it because of my agency. I'm choosing it because I think they are wrong. I think they have said something that is not true. Now, I don't go out and publicly advocate and try and bring people to my point of view. I think that it's problematic if you do that. But you are allowed to, in my opinion, just not think that they're correct on that. Like, if Joseph was talking about the Kirkland Safety Society and I decided that he was wrong about that, I think it was okay for people to say, I don't think that this is a good idea, Joseph, So, yeah. But that I just want to try and express that I think, like, because there were people that came back and criticized me for sort of, yeah, but there is kind of a thing where you get to, decide. There is sort of this, you got to seek your own personal revelation. Sure. fair enough. And you can use your agency based on what you think the Lord is telling you. But when the Lord is telling me when the Lord is telling me that, open relationships in a marriage are okay, like you and I would be able to agree, obviously that's false. Now there's other areas where it's not so clear and it is a harder call to make. You know what I mean? But that's a difference in degree, not a difference in kind. The principle is still the same. The prophets teach, we can accept or we can reject what they teach. They either are speaking the truth or they're speaking falsehood. And if I genuinely do feel like they're preaching a falsehood, then I won't endorse that.
Sure.
And some people may, and I get hit from both sides on this, man, because that is a very tricky and difficult topic, because it does come down to individuals having to sort out truth and falsehood.
Yeah. And something that I've been, looking at this and seeing the conversation going on over the past couple of weeks as it's come to my attention, that my thoughts on this are that we as a society, and maybe especially in the church, have trouble with the idea of submission. It's not a positive word.
No.
And
it's the exact opposite of expressive individualism.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know how, Muslim influencers are dealing with this right now. And podcasters are talking about this because Islam means submission. So, but I bring this up because submission is the very thing that when we submit to God, when we submit to the righteous authority, there then opens up the possibility for transformation in a positive way towards Christ as opposed to away from him.
Can I just make a quick insert on that? Because I don't frame it as submission to authority as much as and all of us could, I think everyone could agree to this, that we all believe everyone should submit to God, right? I think that's fine. And the way I look at it is submit to the truth. If it is true, I submit to it, right? I think, again, the framing that we have for a lot of things, I think gets muddied when we stop thinking of in terms of true and false, rather than in terms of authority and in terms of your own desires and our emotions. It is true and false, both in terms of, let's say, objective truth. And well, I don't necessarily want to change these, but I would say in terms of propositional truth or moral truth, right? Is it morally true that it is wrong for me to do X or for that person to do Y? And in my mind, once you again, I think I will submit to authority when the truth is not clear to me. If there were 12 of the greatest brain surgeons in the world in a room together, and I have brain cancer and they prescribe a particular treatment, I'm probably going to just go with the authority, assuming that they know what's true about the right treatment for my brain cancer, right? Does that mean they're infallible? No. But if I know about something that is true, and then some authority comes and tells me, no, well, I'm an expert, therefore you just have to listen to me just because I'm the expert. I think we have to, I think it is okay to say, no, I don't have to submit to an authority if that authority is saying something that I truly do not believe to be true. Right? I think that's where I kind of lay this distinction between, when it comes to submission, it is submission to the truth. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Sure. Yeah, I can go with that. And I think what I'm trying to get at is I think there's a big difference between how we arrive at our conclusions, or at what point we say, I've arrived. And I think for a
At the
lot of
truth,
people,
you're saying, like how we
at the
arrive at our
truth,
conclusion about what is true. Okay.
right? And look, I'm not a postmodernist and relativist and everything is whatever you want it to be. I'm saying that in the process of seeking out the truth, I would say most people, if they come across something they disagree with, they just reject it flat out. And you can call this confirmation bias, that they automatically accept things that they already agree with, and they automatically reject things they already disagree with. That's just how we process information. It makes life a lot quicker when we activate ourselves and start to seek out the Lord in discerning. The thing about the Holy Ghost and revelation I've experienced is that most people talk about how the Holy Ghost will give you confirmation that something is true. It will testify of Christ, and it'll feel good. One thing I've learned is that there are lots of people who can just feel good about a particular thing that is also in direct contradiction with the revealed Word of God. So it can't just be that you feel good about it. So there's something else. And what I've come to the conclusion so far is that the Spirit will also testify of things that you don't want to hear.
Yeah.
It will challenge you. And so when I think of these things about how do we discern truth, how do I receive instruction or counsel from general authorities, it comes down to, sure, am I submitting myself to the process of discovering truth rather than just am I submitting to their authority? That's a surface level thing to say, I'm submitting to their authority. It's, am I accepting or rejecting this out of a sense of submission to the will of God, or out of a sense of pride to my own sensibilities?
Yeah.
And I think it looks very and feels very different when we go to the Lord and seek these things out. It's been my experience that if there's something that's very confusing or frustrating to me, it's challenging. When I do receive that confirmation of, well, here's that way that it's true, and here's how you can honor it, it's a much quieter, much more individual experience. And
Absolutely.
in that way, I think it contrasts to a lot of what we're seeing in online debates.
Mm-hmm.
Tactics as to logically proving why I'm right or you're wrong, things like that.
So
it's much more quiet.
So it's interesting. One of the things I think that's gone on is that people don't realize the depth to which, like, they don't realize that the questions that they're asking are some of the deepest, most profound questions you can ask. Like when you ask, well, how can I know what's true and what's false? Like, okay, congratulations. Like, welcome to the world of philosophy for the last, 2,500 years. Okay.
Right.
Like, these are not small questions that you're asking, right? Now, the gospel has a particular set of teachings that can help you to understand those very things. But these are big questions, right? And in my mind, basically what you're asking when you ask, how do I know what is true and what isn't? You're asking the great epistemological question. The field of epistemology within philosophy is the study of how we know what we know. And how can you say that you know anything, right? And how can you say what is true and what is false? And what do those terms even mean? And so, again, I've been telling a lot of people that what's actually happening in society right now is that we have been shaken down to where the very core of, I guess I put it this way, because all of a sudden we have all this comfort world where we can actually begin to stop just worrying about the immediate. We're now as a society beginning to really ask deep questions, right? Questions that most people never even thought to ask because they just were so busy with their life that they didn't have much time to really think deeply on the meaning of their life. You know what I'm saying? And they were given narratives that they just sort of accepted. And you'll find that today, someone who's really deeply into a particular career or whatever, like most people don't think about these issues, but with the internet and everything else, the world is more aware of its own, like asking these sort of meaning type questions more than ever before. And these are the fundamental questions, right? And so as Latter-day Saints begin to ask some of these questions, these go back, I mean, these even transcend our own sort of specific Christian denomination within being Latter-day Saints. These are questions of the human soul. And we do believe that we have from what I can see, there has been a conversation going on in Western civilization from the very earliest philosophers up until the present day about these sorts of questions. And from that, Christianity provides the most compelling narrative, in my opinion, about the nature of the, first of all, is there a God? We can go through that level of conversation. Then we can get to, well, who is God? And then you have sort of the Jesus level conversation. And then where is Jesus? What's he about? That's what the church is about, right? But what most people don't realize is, in my opinion, we are re-examining that entire conversation like never before. But people in the church have grown up in this world of Mormonism that's built on the presuppositions of Christianity, which is built on the presuppositions of theism generally, and the idea that there's actually a God in the universe. And we now, and all of these things tie in together because they come down to that big question that you're asking. How do I know what's true, right? Which is, even before you talk about the existence of a God, how can you even know if there's a God, right? I mean, I'm just getting at these deeper questions are hard questions. And Latter-day Saints should not panic if they find that they're trying to sort through some of these questions and think that they've lost their faith and all this other stuff. It's just you have to go back through the conversations that have been having. And I think that's what people like Jordan Peterson and others are doing, is they're helping us to go back and re-examine that this conversation actually has been had. That's what's crazy as I've looked into it. Like, it's not like we're all discovering this for the first time. Like, if you go back and read the people that have been talking about these issues throughout history, there's an immense body of wisdom. And if you were to listen, again, everyone knows him, he's a Jordan Peterson fan. Jordan Peterson is sort of helping people walk through this and to understand these conversations, and people are eating it up. Because when you have a meaning crisis, you have to go back down to the very roots of why anything matters at all. You know what I'm saying? And so I think that when we're dealing with the problem, to bring this back around, and I've kind of gone off on a little tangent, to bring this back around to sort of the brethren and where do they fit into this? In my own feeling is they are a witness of the truth. Okay. They are, I like to use like the brain surgeon example. If I had 12 of the greatest brain surgeons in the world telling me things, and not even telling me specifically, but giving general counsel about the best practices of brain medicine, I'm going to, like, it's okay to cede to the authority. You know what I mean? But the authority that's teaching the general principles of brain surgery, when you actually have to get in and make some cuts with the knife, you have to figure out exactly how to apply the principles that they're teaching to a particular situation. That is true. But that doesn't change the fact that if you're going directly contrary to the best practices taught by the 12 brain surgeons, and every other great brain surgeon throughout human history, and you're going to go and decide to do something totally different, I'm going to go, whoa. You better have a really good argument and explanation for why. And simply claiming, well, I have my own personal authority is like, yeah, but I'm not trusting you over all of this enormous body of authority and practice that has been shown to work over time. And so that's sort of where I couch the apostles, is that they are the authority when it comes to God's general counsel for the world. And I look at them not just individually and not even just as the living quorum, but as the entire body of prophetic witness throughout all of human history. And that's at least for me, that's where I couch the the Latter-day Saint sort of view on what the apostles and prophets are and why they matter in a big way, and why we shouldn't undermine their authority. And if we do need in a particular situation to make an adjustment, that's on us, but we better have a very good explanation as to why, especially if we're veering severely off a very established track. So I don't know if that helps anyone.
Yeah. No, there's a lot to say about that. But I'd start in just saying that I think you're right that more people are waking up or being compelled to re-examine the things that they had before never questioned. And people respond to this awakening in very different ways. Some of them see it as deception, that they weren't made aware of it beforehand. But for me, in a lot of ways, since being a teenager, just growing up and trying to figure things out and figure out how to live my faith, it turned into much like a quest of what you're describing. And having been a teenager in the late 2000s, early 2010s, this is when the new atheists were really in full force and just ripping people apart in debates. And as I've thought about that and just how that's formed cultural debates going forward, I see that, okay, so let's say the church, we've inherited a lot of just theological thought from Protestants. Mm-hmm. Protestants inherited a lot of that from Catholics. And Catholics, well, the Eastern Orthodox would say that they just kept everything the Catholics forgot about. And so there's just this centuries, millennia-long history of theological thought that's been passed down and worked on and revised, and the
theological thought itself is based on the presupposition of theism as a general idea, the idea that there is a ultimate power in the universe that is in some way personal. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
There are levels to this that people don't realize, that we are built, we are I always say the church is the pinnacle of this conversation. Yes. But we're the pinnacle. We're at the very top of the pyramid. There are bases beneath us. We are a Christian faith. We fall into the Christian tradition, right? We presuppose Jesus Christ when we're out telling people about he restored his church, right? Why? Well, people look at me restored a church. Who said there's a church? Who said there's a God? Right. Who said that we aren't living in the Matrix, bro? What are you're making, our message is to a Christian sort of people that are at least willing to accept that Jesus Christ had a church at all. You know what I'm saying? And if they're not, then we got to go back to that more fundamental conversation, which I think is what's going on. And that, and that tradition is so rich and so awesome that when you that is something that is, as I have been made more aware of that and read more about it, we are not the first people to ask these questions, but I think we are the first people where lots of people are asking the question, instead of this sort of small group of sort of intellectuals who actually had the time to not worry about their harvest coming in and had the ability to actually philosophize and deeply examine their life. And so we're all facing an identity crisis because for the first time ever, the new atheists and others came out and they're like, hey, we need to go re-examine all this. And everyone's like, ah!
Yeah.
We've never thought about this before.
Yeah. And here's the thing is that if you are unguided, if there's nothing to guide you along this, what really it is a deconstruction.
Mm-hmm.
When you're deconstructing what you have built your faith upon, most people, or at least quite a few, don't have any reason to presuppose that, okay, well, once I break it all into its constituent parts, I'm going to have a way to build it back up again, even better than before.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is the challenge that people are trying to work through. You said about restored church. What church? God, who's that? like great spirit. That's what I believe in, kind of stuff. But then beyond that, once you get to the bottom of it, because we've been as a church living at the pinnacle in terms of our examination of our faith, there is an exercise of faith there where you say, I'm going to allow these pieces to reassemble in a way that affirms the faith I had and make it even stronger. And I think a lot of people are missing out on that because they just end up among the rubble.
Well, I think there is a deconstruction can't be the goal. The goal, you have to live your life. And if you have to live your life, you have to make decisions based on a value structure, right? Because you have to choose to do one thing over another thing, right? And so if I have to choose between doing A or B, that means I have some sort of a meta value structure that is guiding why I chose A instead of B or C or D or all the other options, right? And so what is the basis of that value structure at all? Is it just arbitrary biology? Is it that I'm determined and I actually don't choose? Like, what is it? And so that's where it has to begin. I mean, you have to live in the world. So you have, and if you're going to assume any sort of value structure, implicit in that is some sort of an idea that there is value and that value can be evaluated. And that, and so to create a basis for that at these very foundational levels, that's what leads people to the belief, well, is not God, they want to talk about like the highest value or whatever, but it leads you to metaphysical questions that without a notion of some sort of a higher power leave you naked and leave you you can't act coherently in the world without some sort of a vague notion of some sort of a higher power. Now, is it personal? I mean, there are levels of analysis to this to where you arrive at theism as a viable thing to, now you say place your faith in something. I am not a believer in faith as I define it is not a belief without evidence. It is a trust based on the best available evidence that you have. It is and evidence is a broad term, meaning maybe it's a spiritual witness, maybe it's whatever it may be. There is a reason why you have placed your trust in this particular thing. In this case, you've placed your trust in the proposition that there is a higher power in the universe, and that power you will call God. And then I have placed my trust in the notion that Jesus Christ is the best explanation for that higher power in the universe. And then within that, I have placed my faith in the proposition that Jesus Christ restored his church to the earth, right? But these are separate conversations that each require at some point to someone to, I always say faith is placing your bet, right? It doesn't mean there's no evidence. Like you're choosing where you're going to place your bet. Faith is a choice, but you're placing that choice because you have to make that choice. And so you got to place it isn't a question of do you have faith? The question is where you're going to place it, because you have to place it somewhere because you have to act in the world. And if you have to act in the world, then you have to have some kind of a coherent narrative for why. And my argument, I've recently read a book, really great book on presuppositional apologetics, is that the atheist and the people who reject even the notion of God, they live incoherent lives. They don't act as if God does not exist. They act as if God exists. And not only that, they act as if that God has all the characteristics of the Western God. You know what I mean? So there's a question of, are you really an atheist if you seem to always act in accordance with, if you don't behave that way? You behave as though there's value, all these kinds of things. And so to me, I became much less stressed when I started to realize that I have to place my faith somewhere. And what's nice is I can leave my faith where it is until someone shows me something better to place my faith in. I don't have to deconstruct. I'm doing the best with what I have rather than having to have the thing that makes perfect sense in all aspects. It's sort of like that thing about, democracy is terrible except for every other option.
Right. Yeah.
I'll tell you, theism sounds awful, except for until you consider atheism. And, Christianity seems awful until you consider every other option. And the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints sounds terrible until you consider every other option. And at the end of the day, you have to consider the options and you have to place your faith somewhere. And so I'm like, well, cool. Show me something better. Show me something that makes more sense. Show me something that's more coherent. My submission is to the truth. And so go for it. But I haven't found anything. And so it's the story of Peter asking Jesus, where will we go?
Right.
Like, he says some crazy thing. It's like, you got to eat my blood and flesh. It's like, that's weird. Like, they're freaking out. Everyone's like, okay, I'm out. This is weird. And he said, well, where else are we going to go? This is weird. I don't get it. But where else? And I've become totally happy because you end up realizing how great it is when you realize how vapid and not sophisticated and empty other views and worldviews are. And so I'm kind of out here. One of the things I feel like I'm doing and what I'm doing is I'm trying to help people to realize that like what we have is amazing when you really delve into it, and it's profound, and you aren't going to find that somewhere else. So unless you want to live in nihilistic deconstruction where you just talk all day about what you don't believe in and live an incoherent life, like, yeah, go ahead, go do that. And you'll be miserable, meaningless, depressed, anxious, all the problems we see in our world, because that's what people are doing, because they can't handle it. They've lost the ability to place their faith in things because they think that faith is this, well, that just means I have to be blind to stuff. It's like, no, you don't. Right? And so I don't know. This is obviously a subject I'm very passionate about because it's something I've been through myself personally.
Yeah. So let me share some of my thoughts on that. I think for me personally, I have a hard time with the idea of optimistic nihilism. And that, I think, is an outcropping of continental thought, which is a group of philosophical schools made popular.
So just for the listeners, kind of outline a little bit what you mean by optimistic nihilism.
Okay. So optimistic nihilism could be summarized in saying life is meaningless. We are just biological organisms floating on a pale blue dot in a vast sea of nothingness. When you die, you're dead. The sun's going to explode in a few billion years. Nothing will matter. No one will remember me. So I may as well have a good time.
Yeah.
That's optimistic nihilism.
Or at least let me maximize my own personal well-being during the 80 or so years that I'm around.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just like, let's just do the best we can, whatever that feels like. And usually it is accompanied by some sort of moral system to do good to others. But there's also a psychotic side if you go far enough. But I have a hard time with that because it lacks a depth and richness that I think a lot of people look for in how they navigate their life, how they ascribe meaning to things. Now, in my experience so far, the more I've delved into these topics of, theology, Christology, all these like really interesting, confusing words to say about the study of particular parts of religious ideas and faith and all that. These conversations have been going on for centuries. They've resulted in the disintegration of many congregations into different sects. There's a lot that goes into it. There's so much to gain from what ultimately is a rational pursuit in understanding God. And I think the thing that we get hung up on, or there's this intractable tension in the realm of faith, is that the church was founded by a 14-year-old boy who had a vision of God the Father and Jesus Christ, was visited by an angel, retrieved ancient records from a receptacle in a hill near his house. Like, so much of these things are based on direct, contact with the divine
Mhm.
that defy rationality. And so there's always going to be a tipping point.
Defy rationality as defined as sort of the materialist, naturalist sort of worldview, because they're not quote
Yes.
unquote irrational. They're just miraculous in the sense that they defy what we would understand as possible in the universe.
Yeah. And so I am careful about that, because if you say, well, it's not rational, you say, well, it's irrational then. Well, people don't like hearing things that are irrational. That's not a good thing. I mean, non-rational. I don't even say immaterial. Immaterial has a lot of baggage.
I've heard the term transrational, beyond rationality.
Okay, trans, maybe super rational. But yeah, there is this tension between, okay, Joseph Smith had direct experience, direct contact with God, and he was commanded to restore Christ's church in that way. And the work of all preceding prophets and leaders was to, I mean, of course, be the mouthpiece of God, but in a way, it was also to operationalize the workings of the church. And so in this way, you see so many, I think historians like to call them theological innovations with Joseph Smith. I would see it as restoration of lost truths. But then after all these things have been revealed, it's okay, well, how do we get people to stop doing things that aren't that? Like we're getting conflated with certain types of mesmerism and astral projection and things like that, like all this folk magic. What are we going to do about that? And so there's this way of operationalizing, standardizing, and rationalizing these things so that they are more digestible, and we can have a global audience for the church. We can reach across different cultures and have it be applicable and something that can change people's hearts. But in this way, we come back to the issue of, well, it all started with direct experience. How do I honor direct experience? And I think this all circles back to the tension of, I mean, maybe it doesn't have to be a tension at all, but what people are seeing as a tension between the Holy Ghost told me this, and that's not what the prophet said. So what do? Am I untrue to myself, or am I true to what the prophet told me to do?
And I think a person should be true to the truth, but it's sort of, right. I circle that around to, there are times to defer to the knowledge of an expert, and you're not crazy for doing that. It's not irrational to do that, depending on a person's level of knowledge. But also, I think for a lot of people, at least for me in my own experience, I talk about people. I say I didn't have a faith crisis, but I did have a faith renovation, right? That went right down to the very deepest foundations. And I got caught up in the exact thing that you're talking about, the new atheist movement. My brother had left the church. I got back from my mission, all that stuff. I'm actually making some videos on this exact experience. Okay. And what happened was I had to, over the course of about a 10-year period, about 2008, 2018, I'd say, where I kind of had to go through and again, I had to deconstruct things because there were things that needed to be deconstructed. But my goal was not to deconstruct. My goal was to put something else in its place that could hold it and to try and remodel the whole building. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. And
so but again, what I came to realize is that you have to understand let's call it the presuppositional structure of your beliefs, because you've built a presupposition in the existence of God. And then based off of that, Jesus Christ is built on the presupposition of God, and the church is built on the presuppositions of Jesus Christ and the New Testament. Right. And, And so by understanding those and realizing that those are independent propositions, like it's not that hard to believe in Jesus Christ if you believe that there is a higher power in the universe that's a personal higher power. You know what I'm saying? Like Jesus's story actually becomes, I'll say at least it's plausible, right? When you believe that there is a God, like there's a God out there, right? Because if God doesn't interact with the universe, it's like, all right, well then who's God then? You know what I mean? Like it's as if he doesn't exist if he doesn't interact with us. And if he did interact with us, well, where, when, how? And it's like, where's the best case to be made for that, right? And that is how I get led to sort of this belief that Jesus Christ, that this story in the New Testament, I think it's true. Fundamentally, maybe not every little thing is perfectly infallible and every word was God breathed. You know, I'm not a wild Calvinist, but once that happens, like if you believe that the Jesus Christ story in the New Testament, like it's legit and it was fundamentally true, well, now is Joseph's story really that implausible? Is it really that implausible to think that an angel appeared to someone? In fact, I would almost expect it. You're dealing with Jesus here. Okay? So do you see how it's like it's I remember the first time I saw calculus and I was a little kid and I saw like a calculus type equation and I was just like, well, that's crazy. Like that makes no sense at all. Right?
Right.
But then once you learn arithmetic and then you learn algebra, you're all of a sudden prepared to understand the plausibility and that actually it makes a lot of sense what these things are doing. And so I think we've forgotten as a society our arithmetic and our algebra. And I think the Jordan Peterson phenomena is him reteaching us. He's reaching a bunch of people who are in the midst of a meaning crisis in their life because all of the identity markers and kind of the undergirding structures of Western civilization have been so shaken by the ideologies of today, which are hostile towards any sort of, everything is an oppressive framework, this masculine patriarchy, it's all just bad. And so it's all been deconstructed and you're left with this just, all of a sudden we can't figure out what men and women are. And this whole thing is a mess. And he's coming in and saying, hey, you know what I did? I went and read the Bible and let me tell you guys, that thing's wild. And I started to think about the effect that it's had on civilization, on what these stories actually mean, on the way they relate to these concepts of masculinity and femininity, all this kind of stuff. And there are people that are like, eating it up because he's not coming at it with a religious, collar on his neck. He's coming at it from the perspective of, I'm just a genuinely sincere psychologist who wants to understand what the heck is going on. And he realized that in these stories and these archetypes and all of this kind of stuff is that we have fundamentally lost the recognition that we behave as though God exists. And not only that, we don't behave as though some vague notion of God exists. We behave as though a particular God exists, and Western civilization is predicated on that belief. And there we go. We now have established a foundation upon which we can begin to build all of the rest of it. And so I guess to kind of transition a little bit into one other topic I wanted to hit on here. Sure. So Jordan Peterson, there's a lot of talk right now about, so I feel like psychologist and psychology, especially because of the Jordan Peterson phenomena, has become really vogue. And with you involved in that field, I'm interested to see what you, as a faithful, and what would you kind of label yourself as a psychologist, as a counselor?
I wouldn't label myself as a psychologist. No. In fact, like we can get into this, but yeah, there's, I would more say just let's just say a coach, a counselor. Sure.
Excellent. Counselor, coach. But regardless, you're operating in that same realm and sphere of helping people deal with psychological sort of issues. But I've had a very hard time distinguishing between the spiritual and the psychological. And I'd be curious what you think about that. Is there a way in your mind that you distinguish between the psychological and the spiritual?
Yeah, I think the way I see it is that the field of psychology is actually comprised of a handful of different subfields, and they have waxed and waned in terms of popularity over the decades and over a century of the development of the field. And right now, I would say when I was getting my degree in psychology, which a bachelor's, I'll just flat out make sure your audience knows, doesn't really prepare you for much. It prepares you to get a master's or a PhD, which I might go back and do. I got a master's in business instead. That was more practical for me. But one thing that was my experience was that it was almost exclusively dedicated to the field of neuroscience, cognitive science, behavioral psychology, these different fields, a much more materialist, naturalist perspective on things. The root of psychology actually comes from shamanic practices, where ritual elders of particular tribes and societies would guide people through life transitions or help them be healed from certain mental illnesses or just psychological trauma.
So real quick, you're saying that initially, so psychology actually nowadays has a very materialistic sort of bent to it. It presupposes that human beings are just meat computers processing information, and there's a certain level of psychology that views things that way. But you're saying is that there's another side of psychology that is more based in a less materialistic point of view and actually is ultimately rooted, like you're saying, in shamanic tradition and religion?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that psychology is the sanitization of what people have been doing for generations and generations of centuries
within
past.
religion.
Within religion. In fact, I'm forgetting who said it, but I've been reading a handful of books, just trying to dive deeper into this side of things. But yeah, it really comes down to the idea that nowadays, without religion necessarily, in a agnostic or atheist society, psychologists and the people of academia are effectively secular priests and shamans. That they serve the same role of spiritual and ethical navigation.
Well, I look at
And
someone
so,
like
in this way, just to answer your question,
go ahead.
yeah, it comes down to. I was just going to say, just to be clear, I believe that psychology now is just an outgrowth of what has always been there in terms of spirituality.
So yeah, so if you were to separate the materialistic side of it, the rest of it is, I mean, it can't be a science at that point. If you're dealing with an aspect of human nature that no longer is talking about the physical, then you have to be talking about something approximating the soul or spirituality. And so why should, well, this is a question that I've had some people say, well, then why are you going to a psychologist instead of going to your bishop? Why are you going to a secular priest instead of to the actual priests of God if you want to be counseled on spiritual matters? Should not the counseling within the church happen within the confines of those who are the priests? And people say, well, they don't have the training, you know what I'm saying, to be able to offer marital advice or to be able to counsel them. And the church itself even shies away from sort of, there are certain levels to this to where they want to refer you to sort of psychological specialists. And I think there is a distinction at some level between someone dealing with a severe sort of anxiety or depression or bipolar disorder, that their bishop just isn't going to be able to help, but maybe there are other professionals that can help. And I advise people to do that. So where is this line to where the church can provide or to where it's within the purview of sort of what we think of as spirituality, and now you're going to have these other things healed through the use of a psychologist or some sort of a counselor who is, quote unquote, a specialist in that area, but that is not necessarily associated with our church and faith. Is that advisable? I mean, it just seems like a big kind of messy area in my mind when I have a trouble distinguishing between the psyche and the soul.
It is, well, as far as the psyche and the soul go, I don't think they're that different. I think they're pretty synonymous. But yeah, that is pretty sticky. I mean, there are a lot of ethical considerations when accepting somebody as a therapy client, or for psychoanalysis, things like that, or for psychiatric care. Psychiatry is when like medications get involved. I think one of the big vehicles for transformation, for repentance and coming closer to God, it involves a form of confession, that there's an element of submission, which I think is humility. That is putting aside your pride and turning yourself back to God. Now, when it comes to healing from a trauma that you've experienced, I think it still applies that when we are not, when we are working on being healed from a past trauma, eventually there's going to be a part of that process where you're angry, you are resentful and bitter. That itself is an expression of pride. And I don't know why I'm on this so much right now, but it really does, I think, come down to figuring out what it is the will of God is and submitting ourselves to that, because in that there is healing. Now, again, when it comes to, I don't know that I've ever heard really anybody say like, why don't you just go to your bishop about your psychological issues?
Well, and I personally think that, like, and I'm not saying that isn't it is something that I've asked about and had to think about, in the sense of, I guess my best explanation for that is because a bishop has a particular, a bishop is not he is not a specialist in particular types of spiritual and or quote unquote psychological harm. I think that we believe in a very interesting niche between the soul and the body. You know what I'm saying? And I do believe that the bishop plays a role in certain types of spiritual problems, specifically dealing with serious sin as a judge in Israel within the purview that he's been given, right? But that doesn't mean that he's the guy to take your kid with bipolar disorder to, right? Bipolar disorder, so far as I can tell, has something to do with the interplay between the body and the spirit, right? And or environmental factors, and it is a much broader sort of categorization between both the physical and the interplay between the spiritual and the body. Now, I think that people can go to sort of quote unquote mental health professionals for things that shouldn't go to the mental health professionals, because these are matters that really are about, if you live the principles of the gospel, that these problems will resolve themselves. And on the other hand, I think a psychologist, like let's take someone who is a psychologist who specializes in depression, right? and severely depressed individuals. I think that with a proper understanding of the gospel, that psychologist will be more empowered to be able to actually help those people, right? In addition to the scientific and secular study of it. So in my mind, it's sort of when both come together, the secular study and the religious principles, what you get is truth. Again, to reframe this, I don't really care if it's the bishop. I don't really care if it's a secular person. I want someone who understands the principles of truth related to whatever psychological phenomena I want to resolve. And I think that if a bishop has that truth, great. If a secular person has that truth, great. But I happen to think that there's a lot of people out there who, just because they're quote unquote the professional, we assume that they have the truth, when the reality is they're full of bull crap and they just spout utter nonsense. And so again, if we frame it as true versus false, it helps resolve the issue.
There's this, I think, a famous speech, a commencement speech from Hugh Nibley back in the day. He gave one on leaders and managers, and he goes on for like 15 minutes about, because it's a commencement speech, so he's like wearing his PhD, like doctorate paraphernalia, and he goes on about like dissecting how each piece of this is like a piece of the garment of a false priesthood, and he goes in on how academia is a false priesthood. It's rooted in a false power. It's a pretending of the power of God. And I am not an anti-intellectual. I have a bachelor's and a graduate degree. There are plenty of people, I think, out there who are genuine anti-intellectuals. And there's a lot we can learn. And there's a lot we can learn from people who are trained, and those fields can be infiltrated by popular philosophy and popular doctrines, woke ideology. That's all we're talking about right now.
Yeah,
right?
no, and
I think the issue,
and that is a matter, again, that comes down to that truth and falsehood. How do I resolve this? I look at it and I say, well, is the academic person speaking the truth, right? And is then great. And that's part of our religion. Like, our religion is, if it's true, we want it. Like, send the elders out into the world, have them gather truth from wherever they can and bring it to Zion, right? And so I look at, universities ideally are truth mines, where people are mining for truth. And there's and within very specific and specified fields that a bishop isn't going to be able to be aware of. And so when you deal with something that is on a broader spiritual level, you go to the broader spiritual kind of principles that are more general. But when you have a very specific issue with a specific person dealing with a specific problem, if there are specialists who understand the principles of truth related to that, I don't care what title you give them. The label doesn't matter. What matters is, do they know what's true about this issue, and can it be fixed?
Right. And to tie that back into what I was saying earlier about the roots of psychology, when you go to a specialist about a given thing, the process of healing that, or at the worst, mitigating negative side effects to whatever may be chronically affecting you, it is effectively the same as a spiritual transformation process. These things go back to the spiritual root. And so, I think going back to that, it is a quest for truth. And when we talk about universities being a truth mine, I think in a lot of ways facts, I would say, are a subset of truth. And there is truth outside of facts. It doesn't make them necessarily false because they're non-factual. But there are things, I know, like the idea of moral truth is sort of popular. Like, what's the pragmatic utilitarian use of this particular thing? Even though it's not directly factual, it's still useful. I think it's beyond utilitarian or pragmatic. There's things outside of that. And so when we talk about going to places of higher learning, their ultimate purpose, I think, is we have all these building blocks of how we're going to build our faith or our perspective on the world, including our faith. People have been testing out configurations of blocks for generations. And so we're there to stand on the shoulders of giants, as it were. And we can start reaching out from higher places and building off of that. The problem is when we start hacking out the true foundations and replacing it and calling the new stuff that's not based on the true foundations true.
Absolutely. Well, I think I've hit on most of the things that I want to hit on. Is there any other topic you want to hit on before we wrap this up?
Oh, well, Jacob, I got to ask you, where do you see this all going? Or how soon is it going to be until the feminists cancel you? I don't know.
Well, luckily, I think I'm pretty uncancelable. I do have that, luckily. So where do things go? What's funny is I have weird areas of optimism and weird areas of pessimism. I actually am optimistic as I look generally as society, as weird as that may sound. I actually think I don't know when it will happen, but I think we're prone to a religious revival. I don't know if it'll happen in my lifetime, maybe not. But I think that you can only push things down so far before people, it's kind of like the whole pride cycle thing, right? Eventually things hit a rock bottom and people have to wake up. And I think that there's a subset of people that are feeling like the nihilistic crisis. And that's why the Jordan Peterson phenomena is happening. Is because people are actually waking up to that. Are you getting any feedback? I'm getting
I'm not getting any.
I'm just kind of hearing something.
Oh, sorry.
Oh,
I was touching my mic stand. Maybe that was it.
That was it. That was the one.
Sorry.
But within the church, I'm optimistic long term. I'm not optimistic short term at all. I think that right now we are facing in the church a series of divisions that are irreconcilable. And the members are going to have to make a choice. Do you support the family proclamation, for instance, or don't you? I don't think that one is going to be able to be reconciled. And I think that's probably the biggest one within the church. I think the political climate, as the political climate changes, I think the church will hopefully begin to come out of the divisions that exist. But I think that I think the church is trying to navigate really, really difficult waters without losing people. And unfortunately, I don't think that is possible. And not only that, I think that if we don't, as a church, at all levels, be firm and stand for something, that it's only going to be worse. Because the people that want to reject the prophets, they're going to just reject the prophets. And that's just like, they're never going to be satisfied. You can't satisfy them. But what'll happen is as you try to satisfy them, you will drive people that are more orthodox within the church to feel like they've been abandoned, and that the church that they're remaining faithful to is not remaining faithful to itself. And that is something that I worry about as I kind of see people. As I go do what I do, I have one of the fears that I have is the nature of the institution of the church. I'm a huge supporter and proponent of the institutions of the church in the sense of the institution itself, the priesthood authority of the church, 100%. But when I go out and point out things that are going on at BYU, or I point out that Julie Hanks, what's going on with her, and I point out that Deseret Book is carrying certain books like the ones by Papa Osler that basically endorse trans ideology, and I expose that, and I say, hey, look at what's going on here. Like, what's this about? There are a lot of people that comment and say, where are the brethren? Where is the institution? How are they allowing this? And I worry I don't want people to ask that question. I want for people to remain have faith in the institution. But also, I don't know that there's something like, am I just supposed to not say anything? And when I see ideological creep moving into the institutions of the church and fomenting higher levels of discord within the church, like, where do we draw the lines and say this isn't allowed in here? You know?
Yeah.
And so I also say, is there some level of critique that's needed? Not necessarily. I'm very careful to go all the way up to the top, but at the mid levels of the church where people tolerate too much. And then if they tolerate too much, you've just sort of poisoned the well, so that if the brethren do come down and all of a sudden you have half the church that like won't listen to half a conference or don't like are all freaked out over conference because the brethren are teaching what we've always taught.
Yeah.
And so the thing is like, no, we need at the levels of the church, of the medium level institutions of the church, like at the local leadership, their job is to prevent apostasy. Their job is to have the conversations with those that are teaching false doctrine and tell them to stop. Because if people are out there pushing ideas that run contrary to the brethren, like, I don't want anyone to be out of the church. I want everyone. And I don't look at priesthood leaders and want them to go and just like start excommunicating people left and right. But they do need to have those conversations with people, especially if they're in the public eye, especially within our institutions, if they are saying things that are clearly contrary to our doctrines, and tell them to stop. And if they don't, then yes, then you do need to take action. It's a scriptural mandate. And not only that, one of the things that I base what I'm doing with, the whole Julie Hanks thing and all of that, there's a scripture that says that that if there was iniquity among them, that 3 would witness to the elders, right? In other words, the ordinary people, if they saw wickedness that was happening amongst the church and false ideas amongst the church, that they would go and basically make the elders aware, right? And stand as a witness. And I will stand as a witness, not against people individually. Like I don't know Julie Hanks, for instance, from Adam. I don't have anything against her on any sort of a personal level. My whole thing is you are putting out ideas, and all I meant to do with my video was draw a contrast between here's what you said, here's what the church said, here's you with the biggest anti-Mormon out there co-promoting one another. This is unusual. If you would like to come on my podcast and talk about this, please, Julie, here's my email. I put it on the video. Hit me up. She doesn't do that. She goes on to Reddit and says that I'm some DesNat psychopath. And so I'm like, look, I want, if you have 100,000 followers made up of huge groups of LDS women, it's important that they be aware of that they see the lines between what you're saying and what the church is saying, and they know where those lines are so that they don't get confused. And if that's all I'm doing, am I doing something wrong by drawing the lines to help people to see what she said and then what the church said, and they can make up their own mind on it? And if I'm misrepresenting her, this is the whole thing. If I'm misrepresenting her, I want to correct her. I will take down the video if she were to come to me and help me to understand why that's a misrepresentation. But she didn't do that, which makes me say, well, then maybe it is that you, maybe I didn't misrepresent you. But if I did, I'm not going to, I'll talk to you. I'll listen to you. Make your case. I'm not going to sit there and bite your head off and yell at you. Like, just come talk to me. And and publicly, then we can publicly correct the record. But that didn't happen. And so I was disappointed that I don't want it to stand. I don't want to think what I think was going on there is what was going on there, but she has not provided any reason for me to think that some of these ideas that she's teaching are not what she genuinely believes. And that is problematic.
Yeah.
So
yeah. I'd add, if I could, just to wrap this up, I think the way through this all, you're talking about a great shift in society, especially within the church over the next however many years or even decades. The way through this has to come through holding what we know to be true and doubting our doubts before we doubt our faith, like our church leaders have counseled us to do. That there's going to be a time where, in contrary to what a lot of people these days are saying about the nature and personality of Christ, it also says in the Bible that he's going to basically tear families apart. Mm-hmm. That father and son are going to be at each other's throats. Mother and daughter will be in conflict, and a man's household will be filled with his enemies. These things, I think, can easily be turned into fear-mongering and drawing all these lines and just ultra-orthodoxy. I think there's an excess part of this. But at the same time, I see the greater issue is in too much permissiveness, which you seem to be suggesting, and that we need to...
And believe me, I am hyper aware that I have to be careful that I'm not reactionary to what's going on, to where I react, because you get that whole, like, one person does something, but then the reaction is an overreaction. I want to respond appropriately to what I'm seeing in the world and not allow it to sort of make me go, like you're saying, there's sort of a reaction into ultra orthodoxy. And I'm not an ultra orthodox. I'm saying is that there needs to be, again, even these labels that I'm using, like, it doesn't matter. All that matters, is it true? Is it false? Is it true in relation to, like, is this what I should do? Like, should I make a video like that? That's a question. And I believe that I have a justification for it. But could someone convince me that it was false? It was wrong. It was morally wrong of me to make a video like that. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. And so I think all of us need to, that are on the more orthodox side of the equation here, that we need to be careful that we don't overreact, but also that we don't underreact. And that is, that's like my current, like, conundrum that I'm trying to sort through myself, is what is the proper response? How do you do what Elder Oaks was just talking about, where you stand up for what's right and stand up effectively? And he even said, have the debates, but not end up in a what he called an overly contentious way. But there has to be some level of conflict and contention. It's impossible not. And so this is a very hard issue to sort through. It's not like, this is not some cut and dry thing where it's just like, yeah, just like, be nice. No, there's a level to which we have to figure it out. And I'm trying to sort that out myself as best I can. But we have to, but yes, we have to, we have to stand up for what's right, and we can't give in to the permissiveness while at the same time not going too far the other way.
Yeah. And my advice would be, in summary of our whole conversation, is that if you find yourself personally, just speaking to the audience, if you find yourself personally more drawn towards the ideas, the qualities of God that emphasize his justness, his orderliness, spend some time thinking about how can mercy still be honored through that sense of justice and order. And then on the flip side, if you err on the side of forgiveness, permissiveness, compassion, think through, how can I be all of that, but then through it also be just and a protector of righteous boundaries? Because like we've been saying, it's not just be both, just be a good person. There are two opposite virtues that we have to both honor, that are characteristic of Christ. And we need his help in order to learn how to do that situation by situation.
Absolutely. Great stuff. Well, I think that's a good place to wrap up. But before we do, tell people if they want to get in touch with you, tell us a little bit about how they can do that and what things you offer with HenHouse Coaching.
Sure. Yeah. So you can find me on Facebook and Instagram. I'm mostly on Facebook, and it's just Sam Heninger. What we do, Miranda and I, we actually help married business owners create more harmony and, I would say, momentum in both their relationship and the business. A lot of times these are in conflict with each other. So we help people sort out, like we've been talking about, better boundaries, but also honoring each other's inherent value, ranked order values, I'd say. So we're all about bringing all the good together and celebrating it instead of criticizing it.
And I imagine, obviously, that coming from sort of someone who shares your faith, that can be really meaningful. I know, lots of people I know do different kinds of counseling. I've been involved with it myself as a recipient of it, and it's very, very helpful. So I highly recommend that if people are having a rough time with their marriage and their business and that kind of stuff, that they reach out to you, just because I know that this. That, again, going back kind of to what we said, that this sort of specialized counseling and specialized understanding, but with the gospel kind of, with it being viewed through someone who understands the gospel lens, I think can be really powerful. So I wish you the best in all that. And thank you for coming on today. It's been real fun.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
All right. Take care, Sam.
Take care.
If you enjoyed this video, give it a like and hit the subscribe button. Also, if you want more content, including the podcast, go to thoughtful-faith.com. Thanks for watching.